Good morning to all. I think we can start. Welcome to our meeting. So we are nearly 200 before our screen this morning. So it shows a great interest in our topics today. So I'm Eloi. Sorry, I'm trying to change the slide. Oops. It's working. So I'm Eloi. I'm leading the market intelligence work for Euroheat and Power. And before we kick in, I will say a few words about the new organization of Euroheat and Power. As of 1st of September this year, a new unit dealing with market intelligence was created. And the objectives of this new work stream will be to increase our capacity to gather data and identify trends for our sector. So this will be of interest for our industrial members, for national associations, and of course also to feed public discussions on the role of our sector in the energy transition. So along the preparation of the next district heating and cooling market outlook, which is our flagship publication, we publish reports on technologies and markets, and we are planning to organize dedicated workshops. So right now I can tell you that we are working on a workshop on large-scale heat pumps to take place in December. So the event today is the first of events we will organize on a regular basis. So today we will focus on Germany and on BEW, which is the new financing scheme to deploy green district heating, which was approved by the Commission this summer and which entered into force 3 weeks ago. Today, both the climate question and current circumstances triggered by developments in Ukraine make this meeting very relevant. We all know there is need to fasten the pace of change on the heat market, and there are proven solutions to phase out fossil fuels and provide affordable and sustainable heating solutions for citizens. So I'm really glad we have distinguished speakers with us this morning. Laura Napolitano and Alice Gallo will provide the views of the Commission, and I'm equally delighted that Guido Schwabe and Johannes Donsberger from AGFW are here to share with us the views of the sector. So this discussion will provide us with more insight on the German market, but it should also provide some hints on the possibilities and growth prospects offered by the guidelines on state aid for environment and climate, which entered into force in 2022. Before we start, I will provide you with a snapshot of the German market, and the information is based on the Euroheat and Power Market Outlook 2022 and the contribution of our German members of AGFW. On this slide, thank you. Well, here you can see the scale of the challenge. So the heat market in Germany is still very much dominated by the use of imported fuels, mainly natural gas, but also heating oil, which represent 75% of the total. District heating represents 14% of the market. Market shares varies from 7% in small communities to over 26% in large cities. 1/3 of new buildings in Germany are connected to district heating, which is a very encouraging figure. However, there are around 250, 300,000 new buildings put on the market in Germany every year, which means that the focus must be on the existing building stock. On the next slide, you can see that in terms of policy objectives, Germany has committed to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the energy and heating sectors by 2045. And the BEW scheme we will discuss today is meant to support this objective, along with other measures. But overall emissions should be reduced from 2020 to 2030 by 65%. On the next slide, you see what it means for heating. And here I refer to a study by Prognos. So the objectives in terms of emission reductions are expected to be met with well, further measures in terms of energy efficiency and the deployment of efficient and green options, such as district heating in urban areas and heat pumps for areas with less density where heat loads are dispersed. But along this forecast, well, district heating should double its market share. And the slide you see here refers to supply to buildings. It does not cover supplies to the industrial sector. On the next slide, you can see that the growth of the sector will occur with actually a change in terms of the fuel mix. So basically moving from the efficient use of fossil fuels towards large-scale heat pumps, renewables, and also more use of waste heat. We know there is a large potential in Germany and in Europe for waste heat. In terms of opportunities for the industry, well, you can see on the next slide. So as I said, so district heating is expected to double, so to reach nearly 1/3 of the heat market, with the densification of existing networks, the development of new networks. As you can see here more in detail, when it's growing, it's a changing sector with a renewed fuel mix, but this will mean, well, the deployment of new pipes, new infrastructure, substations, meters, and the digitalizations to make systems more efficient. So it's also a lot of new market developments. And BEW is all about accelerating the pace of change. So here is for a snapshot on Germany. And now I'm really happy to give the floor to Laura Napolitano. So Laura is a case handler at DG Competition. And Laura, this morning you will provide some highlights on the new guidelines for state aid and their relevance for district heating. So now, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eloy, for inviting me to this webinar. Let me see if I can change the slides. Okay, perfect. Indeed, so I will first maybe quickly talk about the new CEEAG guidelines, which, as Eloy pointed out, were approved at the beginning of the year. These are the state aid guidelines for climate, energy, and the environment, and compared to they replace the EHP guidelines, the previous guidelines. And let's say that the aim of such revision was indeed to make sure that the state aid guidelines would be more aligned to the objectives of the Green Deal. In particular, state aid control is aimed at indeed also ensuring that the aid is directed where it is most necessary for transitioning away from fossil fuels and reaching the climate and environmental objectives of the Green Deal. So maybe looking a bit at what DG Competition and the Commission looks at when conducting a state aid assessment. In particular, on top of indeed checking that the aid is granted for measures that will help switch away from the most polluting fuels and have a positive impact on the environment. We make sure that the aid is limited to what is strictly necessary, therefore proportionality is checked. And also that it does not have an unjustified negative impact on competition and the single market. So there are some positive conditions that are assessed and some and balanced with the negative conditions of the potential measure in state aid. So looking at aid for district heating and cooling systems more in particular, these type of measures, they fall under section 4.10 of the CEEAG guidelines. The rationale for allowing state aid to promote district heating systems is that to promote the energy efficiency, sustainability, and the use of renewable energy sources for district heating. This is because there could be market failures that lead to underinvestment, and therefore state aid may be necessary to overcome these market failures. There are several types of investments that can be supported under the guidelines, in particular for the construction, the upgrade, and the operation of, to begin with, well, generation units, so district heating generation units, provided that these are run on renewable energy sources, waste heat, or through high efficient cogeneration. Maybe a small digression here is not in the slide, but waste incineration can also potentially be considered so long as the waste hierarchy principle is respected. Therefore, that waste is first avoided, is prevented, recycled wherever possible, and then if not, it can be used for district heating. It has to also be renewable waste and or be used in high efficient cogeneration. Other investments that are supported are investments in thermal storage solutions, as well as the distribution network. Maybe about the distribution network to point out that upgrades can also be achieved through smart and digital solutions. This can also be supported. One condition for this type of investments is that the upgrades need to result in meeting the efficient district heating and cooling definition as per the EED directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive. And if the investment do not directly lead to meeting this standard, the member states need to ensure that the beneficiary will will start the work to meet these standards within 3 years following the upgrade works. There are 2 exceptions for the type of measures for district heating and cooling that fall under section 4.10 of the CEEAG guidelines. And these are measures that are only supporting the distribution network only, where such distribution network is open to third-party access and has regulated tariffs. So in this case, it can be considered as energy infrastructure and can be assessed under section 4.9 of the guidelines. Finally, in very rare cases, the member state can demonstrate that district heating system could be subject to a legal monopoly or a natural monopoly conditions. The conditions, you can find them in the guidelines. And well, in this case, if the member state can demonstrate this to the Commission, then the measure can be considered no aid, and therefore no official measure has to be adopted by the Commission. Okay, so now we've seen which type of investments can be supported under section 4.10. And maybe to look at why indeed this state aid for district heating system can be considered necessary and appropriate. There is a presumption of market failure, and therefore there is a presumption that district heating can indeed address such market failure by making sure that the investments in more efficient district heating are made. However, this is not the case for operating aid. So for the case of operating aid, there is an extra proof. The member state needs to demonstrate that the operating costs cannot be successfully passed on to customers without having a negative effect on environmental protection. Then the next part that is assessed is, of course, the proportionality. So whereas in the EHP guidelines, this was done through maximum aid intensity, the CEEAG now foresees the use of funding gap approach. The funding gap analysis is, in simple terms, basically calculating the net present value of the project absent state aid, where there is a negative net present value that can be considered as the funding gap. This is very simplified, of course, and this can also include a counterfactual scenario, which is the investment that the beneficiary would have made absent the state aid measure. Therefore, the member state can also feed in the funding gap analysis, the net present value of a counterfactual scenario. This, however, there is an exception. This is not the case for what concerns investment in distribution networks, simply because there is assumed to be no alternative investment given the resemblance with energy infrastructure investments. Finally, oh, sorry, I moved one too many. Perfect. The last part of the assessment, it's indeed about evaluating the distortive effects on competition and trade on the single market. And it is considered that the most polluting fossil fuels, therefore coal, lignite, oil, and diesel, they have negative consequences of competition and trade, and therefore measures supporting these fuels cannot be adopted. There is here as well one specific exception, which is only for investment in the distribution network only. There are three conditions that need to be met for this to be approvable, let's say. And this is in particular that such distribution network needs to already transport heat generated from renewable energy sources or waste heat or carbon neutral sources. Second, that the aid does not result in increased generation of energy from the most polluting fossil fuels, for instance, by adding to the network even more polluting generators. And finally, the member states need to have a clear timeline involving firm commitments to transition away from the most polluting fossil fuels. For natural gas, this is still considered a transition technology. Therefore, investments for generation units, which are high efficient cogeneration running on natural gas, are still possible. However, the member state needs to clearly demonstrate how the investment will contribute to reaching the 2030 and 2050 climate targets, how a lock-in effect will be avoided, for instance, by having such generator be hydrogen ready. This is just an example. And then finally, the member state needs to explain and demonstrate that this investment will not displace investment into cleaner alternatives that are already available on the market. Okay, so this is, let's say, the last part of, in general, state aid assessment under the new guidelines for district heating systems. I will now leave the floor to my colleague Alice Gallo, who will present the German measure in detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Alice Gallo. I work at the European Commission in DG Competition, and in particular in the unit that deals with state aid in the energy sectors. And I will delve a bit more into what has been done on the Bundesförderung für effiziente Wärmenetze. I'm sorry, you will forgive me for my terrible German accent, I hope, but my German is slightly rusty from working in Brussels mostly. I don't know if I can change the slide yet. Perfect, maybe I can. Perfect. So let's start from what the German scheme, the Bundesförderung für effiziente Wärmenetze, concerns. So here are some few features of the scheme. The main feature, this measure is a Germany-wide measure that is aimed at supporting up to 680 megawatt of renewable heat per year and to decrease emissions by 4 million per year. This is, of course, a huge measure in that sense. It aims in particular at supporting the construction of new district heating systems, which have a share of renewable energy or waste heat, either produced or transported, of at least 75%. But also to the decarbonization of existing district heating schemes. So it operates, let's say, on these two parallel lines. The measure provides support for a number of separate activities and investment. In particular, it supports the carrying out feasibility studies and transformation plans to understand the possibilities to carry out investments and to operate district heating and cooling system, but at the same time also to decarbonize existing systems. Then it covers investment aid first for heat generation, but also for the heating network, also for its decarbonizations, also for existing one, and for heat storage. And on top of investment aid, it provides operating aid for heat pumps and thermal heat production, only as the only two technologies which can receive operating aid on top of investment aid. The scheme is set to last for 6 years, at least the decision that we took for approving it approved it for 6 years, and the overall budget over the 6 years is almost 3 billion euros. So it's also a large measure in that sense. Going a bit more in depth as to what the types of aid and aid intensity are under the measure. The aid is provided under the BEW in the form of a non-repayable grant. And then the level of aid is defined for the first few bullets, for the first 4 bullets, in terms of aid intensity, while for the latter, it's calculated on the basis of the production of heat. So first of all, we have feasibility studies and transformation plans, where the former are supposed to cover new district heating system, while the latter existing ones. For this, aid support is granted up to 50% of the total cost of carrying out such studies and developing these plans. And it's capped at a maximum of 2 million per application. The investment aid, on the other hand, I developed here in these slides the different type of investment aid separately. So we have investment aid for the construction of a new district heating system. We have investment aid for the decarbonization or upgrade of existing district heating systems to operate on the basis of renewable energy and waste heat. And finally, we have investment aid for the installation of heat generation sites, so for renewable heat, solar thermal generation facility, and so on and so forth. For all of these categories, investment aid is provided up to 40% of the investment cost, and up to a maximum of 100 million per application. Finally, I mentioned, anticipated before, that operating aid is calculated based on the generation, and it's also calculated based on the seasonal performance factor or seasonal coefficient of performance of heat pumps, for example, while for solar thermal is calculated only based on the generation. So it was a bit more difficult to summarize with a percentage here, but keep that in mind. I'm sure the other presenter that will follow me will go more in depth in this. Now, aside from what the measure is, let's look at it a bit from the stated perspective. So this measure was one of the first schemes to be approved under Section 4.10 of the CEEAG, and in general, one of the first large measure of this size to cover as a scheme district heating in a country, in a member state. Therefore, there were a number of difficulties that we had to face also from the Commission side as to how to assess correctly this measure. It has to be noted also that this measure was initially pre-notified and also notified under the EHP, so the previous set of guidelines for state aid in the energy sectors. And then, however, it was adopted under new CEEAG. The new CEEAG foresees that every decision that is taken after its entry into force, which took place in January 2022, needs to anyways comply with the new rules, so no, with the old rules. Therefore, there was a bit of a need to reassess the measure under the new guidelines, and that meant that there was a bit more time which was involved. In particular, the new CEEAG introduced new requirement for state aid for district heating and cooling, and also in general for aid in the energy sector. I will mention as my third bullet the funding gap calculation, for example, which was something that was just introduced and that Laura already explained very well before. But also the requirement for an evaluation plan, which was much more clarified in the new guidelines with respect to the previous one. Moving on to the scope of the measure. In fact, the scope of the measure per se was something that had to be discussed widely, not only between DG Competition and the German authorities, but also involving the colleagues in DG Energy. In fact, we had to define a bit better the scope with respect, especially to waste heat. The measure initially had foreseen a different scope for this type of heat generation technology, but also for heat pumps, where in the end we landed on the possibility to provide additional support for such heat pumps when they have a seasonal performance factor of at least 2.5, which means that in practice all the heat that they produce is considered renewable, based on Annex 7, if I recall correctly, of the Renewable Energy Directive. So this is also something that came out after a number of discussions with the colleagues in DG Energy. I mentioned quickly the funding gap, and Laura already explained what this consists of. The funding gap calculation is something that is only partially new to section 4.10. In fact, it was already to some extent possible to use this approach under the previous guidelines, but the relevant point with respect to funding gap in this sense is that, as you have seen before, as I mentioned before, the German scheme foresees aid to be defined as a percentage of costs, so on the basis of an aid intensity approach, while the state aid guidelines under section 4.10 on district heating and cooling foresee aid to be capped at the funding gap in order to be considered proportionate, as the funding gap is ultimately, let's say, an indication of the minimum level of aid necessary to undertake a green investment compared to a conventional investment. In this sense, in fact, it was necessary for the German authorities to submit the calculation of the funding gap. Since we're talking about a scheme here and not individual aid, and a scheme that is as broad as it gets, we had to have a calculation for the funding gap for reference projects, which are example projects which could be supported under the scheme. And moreover, we had to introduce an additional cap to the aid in the measure. So it's not only 40% or 50% of the investment costs capped at 100 million per project, but also there is an additional cap at the funding gap to ensure that aid is proportionate. Finally, with respect to the evaluation plan, I mentioned that the new CEEAG introduces a stricter requirement for the submission of an evaluation plan. In practice, this means that for schemes and measures in general, which have a budget above a certain threshold, which I believe is 150 million per year, or 750 for the lifetime of the scheme, there is a need to submit an evaluation plan as part of a notification of aid, which in this case meant that there was a necessity for the German authorities to submit an evaluation plan at the moment of the notification of the aid. This, of course, was something that took a bit of time, also because it was necessary to have discussion on the evaluation plan to ensure its fitness to actually evaluate the impact of aid. This is something that is very important for a measure of this size to ensure that it can provide a positive impact on the development of renewable energy and heat, in particular renewable heat. So there was something where it was very important for us to develop clearly, and it was not only something that required exchanges at our level, but surely it required also a number of exchanges at the level of the German administration to develop a plan which was indeed sufficiently capable of addressing the impact of the BEW. With that said, thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope it was not too technical. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer the question as we go, but I leave the floor to Eloi, I believe.
Yes, thank you very much, Alice. Thank you, Laura, for your really clear presentations on topics which are really complex. We will take the questions after all the presentations. I've seen that I have already received 2 questions. So one message to our participants: please don't be shy, and please feel free to ask questions. You have the possibility with Zoom. Yes, now we'll go to our next speakers. So Guido will start, followed by Johannes, and well, you will give us information on the context, scheme descriptions, the sector views, and also the lessons learned. So now, please, Guido, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Eloi. For the next minutes, I would like to give you an overview, maybe a bit more detailed about the process scheme of the BEW funding, as well as funding possibilities and eligible items in this scheme. Yes, the guideline Bundesförderung für effiziente Wärmenetze, the abbreviation in Germany is BEW. This I will use for the next slides. So we are talking all about the same, but I will not translate it for the next slides. I will just say the BEW. BEW, as already heard, is the aim of the BEW is to support the decarbonization of energy and heat supply until 2045, and therefore to incentivize investments to increase the share of renewable energies in heat generation in Germany in general. Yeah, let's have a look at the process scheme. First of all, it will start with Module 1. It will be the feasibility study for new erected heat grids or the transformation plan support for already existing heat grids. You start with the application within the BEW, and hopefully after a very short period of time you will get the approval. Then you have 12 months to complete your feasibility study or transformation plan. You've got the option to extend this time for another 12 months. So in the end, after 24 months, the module 1 will be finished. After the module 1 subsequently follows the module 2. The precondition for the module 2 is the end of the module 1, or at least a transformation plan or feasibility study, which is fulfilling the requirements of the module 1. Within the module 1, you identified your next steps for module 2. And yeah, with this plan, you submit for the module 2 with a systemic investment aid. We already heard we are talking about 40% funding aid in this case. After a period of time here as well, you will get the approval, and you now have the time to complete your module 2 measures within 48 months. There you also have the option to extend this period of time for another 24 months. After you finish module 1 and module 2, there is a module 4 option, already heard, the operating aid. You may apply for this module 4 option after finishing module 1 and then module 2. Your plant, for example, is erected, and then you may apply for module 4 for operating aid. This is possible for solar thermal facilities or heat pumps. The application for module 4 has to be done before commercial operation of your plant, and the possible operating aid is limited to a maximum of 10 years, as well as to the funding gap we already heard so far. Well, to support these processes, it all starts with module 1. Therefore, we developed a recommendation to support the companies to create an BEW compliant transformation plan and also to start a discussion in the end. For those of you who are familiar with mathematics, you will have missed the module 3. Module 3, the scheme is the same as in those mentioned before. In module 3, you submit your application for a specific measure aid. Module 3 was installed to have the chance to use windows of opportunities. For example, you already have your plan nearly finished and you would like to start. If you have a look at the timeline before, for module 1, you need at least a minimum 12 months. So that you don't have to wait for this long period, you can start directly with module 3. Yeah, you submit your application for the specific measures aid, and after hopefully a short time, you will get the approval, and you now have the time to complete your module 3 within 24 months, again with the extension option of another 12 months. To apply for specific measure aid, so module 3, this is limited for the next 36 months so far. In the end, this is to accelerate the transformation process, to have the possibility to start very early, because at the moment, nearly nobody already has a module 1 transformation plan or a feasibility study. So therefore, there are options to start directly without this period of time waiting. After module 3, you may also apply for module 4 for the operating aid. But I think this is my personal opinion. This is rather more theoretically, because to get the operating aid, there are 2 requirements which have to be met. First of all, the module 1 has to be completed, or at least a transformation plan which fulfills the requirements of the module 1. And the second one is the first module 2 measure has to be completed. And if we have a look to the timeline, this seems to be quite hard to be matched. So this is a brief overview about the whole process scheme in the BEW with the different modules. Let's have a look about the contribution overview. First of all, the funding possibilities, we already heard about that before, and the eligible items within this part. Module 1, the feasibility study or transformation plan for existing heating grids. We are talking about maximum contribution per application of about 2 million euro, which cover up to 50% of the eligible costs. Module 1 is at least the feasibility study for new build or the transformation plan for extension of heat grids. Module 2, the systemic investment aid, covers up to 40% of the eligible investment costs. The maximum contribution per application is 100 million euro, and already heard, the maximum amount is also limited to the funding gap. Within module 2, several things are or might be added by the investment aid. These are facilities of renewable heat generation, as well as integration of waste heat, then also heat infrastructure like piping, fittings, and so on, and optimization measures like heat storages, measurement and control technologies, highly efficient pumps, heat exchanger, and so on. So there's a huge bunch of things which might be supported in this case. Module 3, the specific measure aid. is very similar to Module 2, especially if we have a look at the funding possibilities, but the eligible items are limited in this case. Eligible items are, for example, facilities for heat generation, for solar thermal or heat pumps, as well as piping to integrate or distribute the renewable heat, and optimization measures like heat exchanger, heat storages, and so on. Module 4, the already mentioned operational aid, is limited for a funding period of 10 years and is also limited to the funding gap and will be annually monitored by the authorities. Module 4 is only for solar thermal plants as well as heat pumps. So I would like to give you a very short overview about this in one slide comprised. So the module 1 is the transformation plan or feasibility study for existing heat grids or new built heat grids with the investment aid of 50% and a maximum of 2 million euro per application. Module 2, the systemic aid, several heat sources might be supported in this way. As well as, not mentioned before, surrounding measures. Surrounding measures might be, for example, backup devices to integrate renewable heat and things which, and surrounding measures are also things you can say which have to be done to integrate the renewable heat sources, but are not really part of the transformation plan. Planning is also, in some cases, part of the aid at this stage. So, in the end, you can say for Module 3, it's the same as for Module 2, but in the end, the supported items are quite limited regarding Module 2. The Module 4, the operating grant or operating aid, is an option for heat pumps as well as solar thermal plants, and only for them. The aid, therefore, is limited to a maximum of 1 cent per kilowatt hour thermal heat generation for solar thermal generation, or depending on the SCOP, we already heard about the seasonal coefficient of performance, and the electricity purchase for heat pumps. It's limited to a maximum of 9.2 or 3 cents per kilowatt hour for thermal weight heat. This is depending on the way you get your electricity, whether it's grid connected or produced by your own. We already saw in the slides before that there's a requirement for Module 4. If you would like to have Module 4 after a specific measure aid, then you have to make the Module 1 parallel to the Module 3 as well, not mentioned here or not shown here, as well as to finish Module 2 while you're finishing your Module 3. Then you might get Module 4 operating aid, which seems to be nearly impossible if we have a closer look at the timeline in the end. So this was a very quick ride through the system so far, and then I would leave the floor to Johannes Dornberger, my colleague from the AG3. So Johannes, it's yours.
Thank you, Guido, and thanks to all the previous speakers. Yes, my name is Johannes, and I'm working here at AG3 in the field of energy economics and politics. And since the subtitle of today's event is the question of if the BEW could be a blueprint for other support schemes in Europe, I want to show you the timeline of the whole BEW in total, and I want to just explain to you what are the core innovations of the BEW compared to other support schemes in Germany, at least. Taking a look at the timeline, I don't want to discourage anyone to pursue the implementation of a district heating support scheme somewhere else, but I just want to make clear from the time the BEW was first announced by the German government in 2017, it took 5 years and 3 governments until it really started in September of this year. And having in mind that Germany's goal is to be climate neutral in 2045, that means that roughly 20% of the remaining time frame was needed in order to get the program started. I think it becomes really clear that we all got to become quicker. We got to become quicker if we do something here in Germany, but even if you implement such a program somewhere else, it's I think it's not feasible that it takes 5 years all over again. And I don't want to blame anyone here, because as you see, it took years on the national level already. But since we're talking about the European level here, I just want to mention the notification process. And even though the letter of approval stated that the program was notified by the German government in June of 2022, it's clear to everyone, and it was mentioned before already, that the initial notification took place when the first draft of the program was published in August of 2021. So I'm perfectly aware that a transition in the state aid guidelines isn't helpful for speeding up that process, but it was 1 year that it took from the initial notification to the start of the program. We, of course, as a district heating association, for good reasons, we were sidelined from the discussion between the national authorities in Germany and the Commission, but we were still able to put 2 and 2 together and get a hint of what were the topics discussed and between them. And 2.5 of them were already mentioned before. I think the question of how you define the funding gap, and also the question of if operating aid is necessary, were of course the central questions. And one other question that was, at least to me and to us, was still kind of puzzling, was the role of the waste incineration, the heat from this heat source. Because in the draft in 2021, it was still included, or it was able, it was supposed to be fundable under this draft, but in the end, it got kicked out of the final version. And we heard already something about that it's even under the new guidelines, there would be a possibility to include it. And I just want to stress what the consequences of this decision might be. It's not just that there might be less of an investment into new projects, but it also leads to some kind of uncertainties which role waste incineration will play in a district heating system in the year 2045. We spoke to several operators of district heating networks, and they, at least they're uncertain if they have to exclude waste heat incineration from their vision for 2045. And I think the worst case scenario would be if there are still waste incineration plants in 2045, probably operating differently than today. but that have to waste their generated heat because they were not included in the transformation plans written 20 years prior. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands that the structure of the BEW is as it is today, that will shape the look of district heating networks for the next 25 years. And I think Guido already gave us a good summary of the structure of the BEW program, but I want to emphasize once more on what are the innovations compared to other already existing and still existing or older supporting schemes, at least here in Germany. I think the most important innovation is that former programs always aimed at the support of a singular measure or of the support of the construction of a new district heating grid, and so for the construction of small grids. But the BEW for the first time makes it possible to support the gradual transformation of networks, and that is the key in order to transform and to decarbonize the large existing district heating networks in German cities, and so to make them future-proof and to make them competitive in order to attract new customers and to grow in the future as well. So far in German district heating, the most important and central supporting program was the CEHP program, and all the supports were included in this program. So and before the BEW, in order to get financial aid for renewable heat generation, it always had to be combined with the cogeneration plant. And now with the BEW, it's for the first time on a large scale possible to get support for a standalone renewable heat generation unit. And the other really crucial innovation of the BEW is that it that operators are able to receive operating costs not just for the cogeneration plant, and therefore only indirectly for the renewable heat generated via the electricity production, but receiving an operating cost for the renewable heat generation itself. And in our opinion, that's really important in order to be able to close the funding gap for the renewable heat generation, and therefore it's the key in order to accelerate the investment in green district heating over the next at first 6 years and over the next 25 years. And speaking about the funding gap, I think that's the last of those dramatic changes that the BEW brought in comparison to other programs. Just click through all of that, and most of the details were already mentioned by the DG Comp and by Guido. Of course, there's an absolute limit of 100 million euros per application for every operator. That's of course due to state aid regulations, but also to budget limitations in the BEW. And then there's the already mentioned relative limit of 40% of the investment cost. But the new thing here for the BEW is that there's a third limit that was also already mentioned, and that is the funding gap. So far, the funding gap was just a question of yes or no. In the programs we knew, for example, the CHP program, you had to prove that there was a funding gap, and if you were able to prove that there is one, the project was eligible for funding. And here, the amount of the funding gap limits the amount of aid you could receive. I think it was already mentioned twice, but I wanted to show it with an example. With the comparison of two really similar investments into, for example, a large heat pump with an investment cost of 10 million euros, for example. For case one, the calculated funding gap would be around 6 million euros. That means that the relative limit of the 40% is still lower than the funding gap, which means the relative limit sets the amount of investment aid granted for the project. In case two, on the other hand, the funding gap is smaller and just amounts to 3 million. Reasons for that could be that it's maybe the same heat pump, but using a different heat source at the higher temperature level, for example. In this case, the limit for the receivable investment aid is set by the funding gap and will amount to the 3 million of the funding gap. And what that means in the end is that almost every project is going to end up with an individual aid rate. They may differ, as shown in the example on the left-hand side, in the aid intensity, but they could also differ in the duration of the operating aid granted to the project. Because if we go back to case number one, here there's, as you can see, basically there's still some of the funding gap left over. And if we just assume that this project is a heat pump that would be eligible for operating aid of, let's say, I'm just spitballing some numbers, 500,000 euros per year, it would mean that it receive this operating aid for 4 years until the funding gap is kind of used up more. And what that shows is that the result of these individual rates, they depend on the assumptions made while calculating the funding gap. I think it was already mentioned, but for doing so, we received basically an Excel sheet that was made by the National Executive Authority for the BEW, which is kind of a black box for us. We don't know all of the assumptions made in there, but what we know is that it also depends on some of the assumptions every operator makes. For example, of the costs of the commodities for the electricity used in the heat pumps, but also depending on the costs of the technology. So that means the date you submitted your application is crucial for the result of the aid granted. It's really possible that we're going to end up in 2 or 3 years at one of our events, for example, where two different operators going to meet and they talk about their experience with the BEW, and they share their experience about roughly the same project, the same heat pump, for example, and they're going to end up with completely different aid intensities because one started or submitted the project or the application in 2023, and the other one submitted it in 2025 when for example, the specific costs for the investments were lower or the costs for the electricity were higher, whatever it is. It's a challenge for communicating that to both the operators, the companies, but also for them to communicate it to their customers, why there's a difference or why it's it's going to end up with different prices due to different aid intensities for the same project. I think I want to end here. We still have some more minutes for some question, and I hope I didn't, or I hope I encouraged everyone in the audience to take a detailed look into the program, and especially not just into the structure, but also into the consequences each of these details can have for each operator. Yes, thanks for everyone.
Thank you, Guido. Thank you, Johannes. It was really interesting, very, very dense. I have one question, and then I would like to give the floor to our colleagues from the Commission. It's regarding operating aid. It's quite rare for heating, but we heard that actually it's allowed under some conditions with the new guidelines. In the current market circumstances, do you think that actually operating aid will be necessary for our projects in Germany on top of investment aid? Could you react, please?
I think the operating aid, I'm sorry, I just start to answer. I hope it's fine. I think the operating aid is part of each individual calculation for individual projects, and by implementing the funding gap, I think actual developments in revenues as well as in cost increase and so on are considered, and personally I think they are needed. But if the economic circumstances show that they are not needed, there will be no further funding due to the funding gap limit. So in the end, I think it's good to have them, to make it to go on with these projects, but there's no danger to let's say over support any project. So but it's good to have them.
Thank you, Guido. Johannes, do you want to add something?
I think Guido already mentioned the main points of the question.
Okay, good. Thank you, Guido. It was all clear. Alice, do you want to take the floor? There was a series of questions, important points and really good points mentioned by Johannes and Guido. Do you want to react, or Laura?
Yes, sure, if it's possible, just maybe a reaction to the latest points that were raised. First of all, maybe as to the timing of the decision of the BEW, as you well noted, that there's been a timeline between the moment in which we received the notification and even from the moment in which we started discussion with the German authorities about this. I already mentioned some of the issues that took a bit of time out of swifter decision-making in the process of the BEW. What I would also like to flag is that I believe the process could be made better and swifter if there would be a submission of information which are complete from the side also of the member states. I think one of the factors that took a lot of time, and I already mentioned for the decision of the BEW, was also the evaluation plan. It is true that we have received information about the measure earlier on, but we have received the first draft of the evaluation plan in May 2022, which of course meant that even willingly, we could not have taken a decision much earlier than what we did, considering also timing that is required for adoption and consultation of the different services of the Commission. So this is just to flag this. Of course, going forward, I saw this is also a Q&A question, so maybe since I'm already talking about it, I take it directly. To make the process swifter, I believe it would be very fundamental to receive complete information, as I mentioned, as to the funding gap, which is something which is fairly new. For us, it's really relevant to receive all the different assumptions behind it and all the calculation. This, of course, speeds up a lot of the process, because if we need to go back and forth to ask all of these questions, it takes away a lot of time from the process. So complete information and assumption are fundamental, especially since the funding gap is a forward-looking exercise. So it is based on assumption, and the assumption are what is evaluated on our side, aside from the values that are included in the calculations. Maybe one more point, which was on the funding gap and on the fact that it might result in different level of aid for similar projects. The idea on our side is that the funding gap, it's ultimately a measure of what is the amount of aid necessary to carry out a project, exactly because it's calculated as the overall cash flow over a lifetime of an investment, so including the revenues, for example, or the operating cost, with respect to that of an investment which would be realistically carried out without aid. So it summarizes exactly what it's needed to incentivize an economic actor to undertake an investment which is greener. Whether this is different for different actors, that's well understood, and it might just reflect the fact that they have a different need for aid because of different, for example, level of financing that they get, or different market price that they get, which are necessarily individually set, but because they might depend on the overall risk of a company carrying out a project and so on. So it is true that this approach with the funding gap might result in different levels of aid for similar project, but what is relevant on our side is that the aid is minimized to what is necessary, and the funding gap calculation is a way to ensure that this is indeed the case, and is individualized based on the specific of each project.
And thank you, Alice. I think these are really important elements you brought. I mean, over the last couple of months, I have a lot of questions from members actually on what the funding gap approach means. Thank you. I'd like to go back to Johannes and Guido. I mean, so we have learned, you know, it was a process that took some time to get approval of the scheme. So we have a lot of members in the room. So what are the lessons learned here? I mean, do you have recommendations for our members operating on other markets?
Maybe I can answer this question. Just one more reaction to Alice. I think I didn't really criticize that it could result in individual rates. I just wanted to make sure that also our members and all over Europe, that it's understood that that's what could happen. To lessons learned, I think one thing that I already mentioned in the presentation is the timeline. Taking the timeline into account is really important, and never underestimate the timeline. Never underestimate the time needed for the notification, for example. I think I personally made a mistake during the last summer when members asked me, when is the BEW going to start? I said, probably no longer than 2 months. And they took that into account for their decision making. And that was something I took away from the whole process. And if we go to the content, I think it's something that maybe is a lesson learned, or not just from the process, but from the content of the whole structure. It's the whole transformation plan. I think the precondition to have a plan or vision for 2045, 2050 in mind is a really good thing, because by doing so, you're making sure that it's not just an individual investment that you support, but you support an investment that's in line with that vision. And for example, if such a plan is in line with the definition of efficient district heating, it could be a 2 birds with 1 stone situation. Guido, do you want to add something?
No, I don't want to add something, just one very short comment. So the timeline maybe also was a, let's say, a problem in this case for the first mover. So maybe we now have a solution which might be a copy-paste option for others who will be the second or the third. So maybe it will be not that crucial for the future as it was in this case.
Okay, thank you. I have a last question for Laura and Alice, but before that, I would like to look at the questions we have received from participants. Actually, there's really a lot of questions, and we have 5 minutes, and I want to end in time. So, is peat, turf soils also considered as part of the most polluting fuels? Guido, Johannes, do you want to answer to this one in 2 sentences?
I'm honestly not 100% sure as of right now. I think it's more of a question into the direction of the DJ Comp, or maybe more of the DJ Energy.
Yeah, if you want, of course, this would be for DG Energy. It's not so in the guidelines we have just some examples of the most polluting fossil fuels. But then I would like to flag that there is an whole section in the guidelines 4.12 which is dedicated to closing power plants also running on peat. So I would definitely say that it would not be eligible for schemes for district heating.
Thank you. I will go to another one, and I think this one is for our German colleagues. Although this was partly addressed, but I will ask this one. Are there typical timelines already known, available, and is the budget spending published? Guido, Johannes?
So the program now is going to start, so there are no typical timelines so far. The experience will show the kind of a typical timeline. As far as I know, up to now, they will be not published, or otherwise I wouldn't know where they are published or will be published. So might be, not sure about that.
Okay, thank you. Another practical question. Are the costs incurred prior to the grant decision eligible? i.e., can the beneficiary start the project execution before it receives the decision for funding? I think this one will be for Alice or Laura.
From a competition point of view, I don't know, Laura, if you wanted to go.
No, go ahead, Alice, thanks.
From a competition point of view, the relevant moment that is a cutoff to ensure that there is an incentive effect in the aid is the application for aid. So it's not the granting of aid. Whenever the project sends an application before starts of work actually happens, then there is an incentive effect for the aid, and that's also what's included in the specific decision clearing this German measure. I think Guido, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, according the BAFA, the Federal Office of Economic Affairs and Export Control, which are in charge of this program, I would like to keep the answer short. No, you're not allowed to start before you've got the permission.
Okay, thank you, Guido. Now I have a last question, unfortunately, a last question to Laura and Alice. So state aid is based on 2 pillars. So there is the guideline, it's a very important pillar, and there is a second pillar, which is GBER. And do you have information as to the next steps regarding GBER and when it will be finalized and published?
Alice, if you want to go ahead. So we are still working on it. We think that the timeline will be the first quarter of next year. It should be approved. Published, I'm not sure, but adopted definitely at the beginning of next year. We are aiming for January.
Okay, Thank you. And now I have 1 minute to wrap up, and I'm sorry for the other questions we didn't take, but it shows there's great interest. So I think the question of the workshop was, is behavior a blueprint for Europe? Well, I think it's definitely a very inspiring scheme in the sense that it is addressing the whole value chain to deploy new district heating, new green district heating. It's also combining investment and operating aid. So given the situation today in Europe, we know that we need dramatically to accelerate the pace of change on the heat market. Well, let us hope that countries with comparable market conditions will be inspired by what is happening in Germany. Maybe also another conclusion I draw from this exchange is that I think that national authorities or our organizations at national level obviously should not be shy to talk respectively well to the Commission, to governments, and obviously well, we need all these discussions on support measures to be really engaged at very early stage, you know, between national authorities and the Commission, just to ensure that, well, adoption is swift and quick. I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you very much. I know that you are all very busy. These are hectic times. So thanks again for your time. Thank you for all participants. And I'm sorry if some are maybe a bit frustrated because we had not enough time to address their questions. So the slides will be made available to all participants. And then I should also say that a briefing note on the German market will be made available for our members. Please stay tuned. You know, we will organize more events. So we are planning one event on large-scale heat pumps in December. And also, I hope that you will join us for our Congress next year in Torino. So once again, thank you very much to our speakers. Thanks for all the participants, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.